Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje eu estou aqui com o professor Fredrik Gregorius, que ele é da Universidade de Linköping University, na Suécia. Nós vamos aqui falar sobre alguns temas relacionados à religião nórdica antiga, que é uma das especialidades do professor Gregorius. Ele tem diversos trabalhos publicados nessa área, inclusive também sobre neopaganismo. E agora a gente vai começar aqui a nossa entrevista. Professor Gregorius, thank you so much for accept the invitation for being here in the channel. It's a big pleasure receiving you here. For a start, I would like to know how to start your interest for research about Old Norse religion, about Viking Age. How you start your interest about the subjects?
Oh, okay. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's that's kind of a big question, so I'm kind of trying to. So I have been I think that my interest in like the Viking Age and particularly more modern, like modern reconstructions of Norse paganism and different kind of groups that are using Norse paganism. My original interest was not so much oriented towards like the Vikings or the Nordic paganism. It was more generally towards modern paganism, like witchcraft, Aleister Crowley, and those kind of topics that sort of that you could find particularly. They were a bit broader, but wasn't particularly oriented towards the Nordic. I think my interest in it was the kind of social environments that we're dealing with here are quite similar. And I'm starting to sort of become fascinated with like modern Nordic paganism, largely due to that, as in contrast to, in Sweden at least, in contrast to, for example, Wicca or Thelema, Nordic paganism answers different questions, or answers different questions than, for example, the more like universalistic pagan traditions to do, or esoteric traditions. And I think one of them was that I started to notice that the like, modern pagans, I'm not interested in the Viking Age as such. I'm interested in how we view, interpret, how we imagine the Viking Age. And the modern pagan community, like the Nordic pagan community, was in many ways representing those ideas. There was sort of, you could see some were into the idea of the Viking Age being almost like egalitarian, like proto-feminist culture. Others saw it as this fight for like Scandinavian supremacy, or like having a more racial interpretation of it. And I think that's kind of what fascinated me with it. There was basically, you could read into whatever you wanted to it. And that's kind of, I wanted to understand why people did choose different interpretations and not others. It's of course a very long and complicated issue how I went to actually start to work on this more professionally, but yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. So do you start researching about things related to Aleister Crowley, and then you pass to the part of like that you say traditions of the modern forms of the paganism, or like related to the Old Norse.
Yeah.
This is very, very interesting.
It's not a clear line. I mean, it's not easy, but you basically, well, I mean, if you look at someone like Crowley, of course, it's also very much, in many ways, a manifestation of a modern mindset. I mean, but he's very clear about it. He talks about that the Aeon of Horus, and people are entering a new age. What I found, but paganism, but the difference, of course, between Crowley and Thelema and paganism in that sense is that while the Thelemic idea is very clearly connected to the idea of a new age, like modern paganism also in many ways are a modern construction, but they try to go back in time, of course, seeing the solutions in pre-Christian traditions that are in a modern setting. Of course, I never met a single pagan in all my research that really wants to go back to the Viking Age. I mean, I don't think any one of those exists. I don't think anyone, disregarding what the views are. I think most people like electricity, and but they do drawing inspiration and arguing that there's something like of eternal value in these kind of culture traditions. It's an interesting case study in generally how we relate to and understand our own history, and how history is continually constructed, and how it gives different ideas and values and so forth. But like, my interest in that is that history is not one thing. It's always like we never look at the past through objective lenses. We will always look through ideological lenses when we look at the past.
Oh, that's very, very fantastic. Very different types of research that one another combine with each other. This is very interesting. So for us analyze the actual forms of neo-paganism that we are discussing, how we can define the actions that was and the activities in the actual neo-paganism? How many types of we can say of rituals or some things that are being doing in the actual neo-paganism in Nordic invasion? Does have some things that are related to the past form of this paganism, or we have some difference? How we can say about that?
Well, that is a complex, I mean, again, very complex question, of course, but I would say, like, well, historically, if we look at it purely from a historical point of view, there might be traces of, might be. I would perhaps not argue in favor of that, but there might be some folkloristic, in some areas of folklore and folk traditions that might have, connections to a pre-Christian past in Scandinavia. That's not something necessarily I would argue in favor of, but there are some who would argue that. Still, regardless of if there is some, there might be something like that, we still have no real ritual survival from the Viking Age in Scandinavia. There's we know very little about the religious practices from the Viking Age. So, like any other person in modern day Scandinavia, if you are a pagan, you will have to face the same problem that like scholars face. That is that we don't really know much. We know some, there was a few very, very limited references in the Icelandic sagas to how actually rituals would look like, how a blute would look like, and some of them are reliable, and some of them are quite unreliable, of course. But so if you're a pagan today, or like a member of a pagan community in Sweden or Norway or Denmark, you will of course be in the same situation as everyone else. You will have to, where do you start? And any religion need practice, any religion need rituals. So what you do see in Sweden and in most like the countries is basically a rituals that are quite a mixture of different elements. Some of them are based on reading Icelandic sagas and the few references we have to rituals there. Some of them are based on like other modern pagan traditions like Wicca. Some of them are based on inspiration. Some of them are based on older, like early 20th century things. So it can differ very much. I mean, my experience with the blute ceremonies that are, you have basically, I would argue that you have at least in Sweden, you have two different types of blute that most heathen, or like, which is the preferred term, most heathen traditions would engage in. And there's a public blutes. There are a big one in Uppsala. That is of course not. It's not the old blute, of course, but it goes back to the year 2000. So they've been going on for 25 years now. Well, a little bit less, but around over 20 years at least. And those rituals are often, quite happy-go-lucky affairs, and people are they're very family-oriented. They're very open to the public, that people can come and just join, and there's a lot of singing, there's a lot of calling to the gods. Then you have, of course, more private blutes that people might do in their own family, or there might be something that you do in a smaller group, which can also differ very much. It's very, like in Sweden, I would say it's almost exclusively, for example, one thing you basically never find in Sweden, it would be, for example, blood sacrifices in connection to blute. That's something that is basically there are few very, very limited cases. Often people living in the countryside, they basically just, they're gonna slaughter something anyway, and they just say pray to Thor or Odin, and then But there is no real set rituals that everyone follows. In my study, I think that everyone in some way do draw inspiration from pre-Christian traditions and in the sources we have, but no one can reconstruct them completely, and the people might be more or less open to innovations, but it's very very different, very different from different groups, how the rituals actually look like. Most of them contains, of course, invocation to the gods. Very common that they use kind of toast ceremonies that you find with, you raise a toast to Odin and Thor and Frey and, the different gods and the ancestors. But apart from that, it can differ tremendously.
Oh, that's interesting. And how we can define a blood example? We can say that what is a blood, and what we can say that they have some relationship with the past in the Viking Age traditions, or he was an invention of the 21st century. We can say about the blood. It's always difficult to answer that.
So blood today, I feel again, many different heathen or Nordic pagan traditions can differ a lot on how they use the term blood. The term itself goes back to the Viking, or it's an Old Norse term, and there are different interpretations of where the word comes from. Some have it, which is easier to explain in Swedish, but that blood is connected to the idea of blowing something up. You basically fill, or some theories that is connected to blood. I think that most would agree that blood has no connection to the word blood today, but I'm not an etymologist. But blood today in heathen communities are usually a reference to different types of ceremonies or rituals, and most of them in more of a religious nature. So, for example, in the same way that you have puja in Hinduism, which can be anything from massive, large-scale celebrations to just something that you do with a household. In the same way, blood for modern heathens can be everything from the public bloods in Uppsala to family celebrations. So it's a generic, it's a term for rituals. That, as far as relationship to the Viking Age in that sense, there is of course the literal inspiration that you find there, that people have read the same sources, the sources we have. They might have read studies on pre-Christian rituals, but there's no continuity. I mean, the modern day bloods that are celebrated by modern heathens are, of course, a 21st century innovation. I mean, I think that there is no. I mean, there's some smaller groups but they claim to go back to old times, but no, it's not really feasible. So I think that we're dealing with a modern religion. We're dealing with a modern spiritual community that draws inspiration, but there is no clear, you can't go back you can't find a trace back to the Viking Age, more than, of course, that they use the same sources that scholars will use when trying to understand the ritual life of the Iron Age.
Oh, that's interesting, because we can say, example, that we have many types of these groups. We have foreign Sidir, Azatua, we have Healthinism, and many of these groups. But we can say that they are complement together one another, or we can say that they are different things, because one say, oh, I am from a group that are more how can I say, more closer to the old traditions, example, and others says, oh, I am much more modern traditions with some relatives of the past. How you can say about this difference of these groups?
So that is something that there are. Sometimes the term reconstructionist is used by the ones that are sort of more conservative, that argue that they are more closer. I think that very few people would argue that they actually are close in any sense of lineage, in the sense that you have in the Catholic Church, where you have like apostolic succession. I think that those who claim to be closer to the sources are that they're talking about the academic, literal sources that we have. I think that's a debate that's been going on for a long time within the heathen communities. That how much do you want to open up for alternative views? How much other influences from other religions can you allow? You see it particularly in the conflict between the more sort of reconstructionist groups and those who practice Seid, which is like this Norse shamanism, neo-shamanistic traditions. The kind of more shamanistic oriented groups tend to be more anarchistic, more open to innovation, more open to personal experiences or personal gnosis, while the more sort of reconstructionist groups tend to be, no, that's fine and all, but we only do this that we can find. I mean, none of those groups, again, we don't know really what people in the Iron Age believed in. So both of them are, of course, modern constructions. I mean, there is no group today that can claim a lineage back to the Viking Age. And I think that there's also something that I think particularly, I think outside of Scandinavia, perhaps more so than in Scandinavia, you do find groups that claim this kind of lineage or claim. I think if you actually live in Scandinavia, that would be very difficult to claim, because I mean, if you know Swedish or like Norwegian or Danish history, it's very difficult to, I mean, argue for such a position. It's very clear how like these countries became, again, some traces of paganism remain in folklore, but basically these countries became quite sort of Christian, and then later went through a quite drastic sort of reformation in the 16th century, where when religion became much more stronger, like Christian religion in this sense. So, I mean, I'm the first one who would say I would love to find groups that actually had some type of connection to a pre-Christian Nordic past, but as a scholar, I haven't found them. But I do know that there are some groups that claim. I mean, they never claim to be actually descendants, but they claim to work more with academic sources, but they are very well aware that they are a modern religion.
Well, that's a very interesting thing to know, that because have some difference from these actual religions, and we saw that sometimes we have this conflict with how these groups have more close traditions to the past, and we know that we don't have so much clues about how these rituals are made or how these things are doing, and we have sometimes these types of conflicts of interest by the groups, but in many times we know that they will complement each other. They don't have some fights every time,
No.
but sometimes have this conflict of ideas, I think.
Yeah.
And oh, you can
No.
you and it's interesting thing. It's in some points of researchers doing how can I say, some aspects of these religions in the past. Some researchers say that we have different locations for cults of the gods of the old traditions. In example, in north of Scandinavia, we have some presence of this type of god, in some points of view. We can say that in Scandinavian countries, we can say that we saw this same perspective. We saw, in example, in Norway, we saw that cults that are more closely to Thor, example, or Sweden, we saw cults that are more related to Odin. How you can say about this type of preference? We have nowadays this preference specifically by regions to regions.
Do you mean that some regions were more oriented towards some of the gods and others?
Yes, yes, yes.
Uh, I mean, that's probably. I think historically that was probably the case. I mean, I think that you also had. I mean, we know very little about, of course. Again, apart from names that we have of different. You have some names that are connected to gods, for example, in Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Iceland, of course. We don't know. There are no real. I would say it's difficult to argue that there is like a clear difference. For example, that some areas were more oriented towards Odin or some to Thor, and some. There are probably some clear, close. For example, Thor was popular all over Scandinavia in the Viking Age. That we know. He was the most popular god, and he was. But you did have very, very significant regional differences. Of course, you had like Norway. What is today Norway was, of course, a much more fishing oriented. They were close. Like most of the settlements were close to the ocean, to the coast. While in Sweden, or what is today Sweden, you had a much more agrarian culture where they were more oriented towards agriculture, and that will of course affect the religions. You do see differences in. But there's also a problem. You have different regions. Like, it's very difficult to know. I mean, we're talking about polytheistic traditions here that would worship many gods, and it's difficult to know what they themselves believe. I know it is definitely a type of idea that still is around among like modern pagan groups, heathen groups, that the gods of Scandinavia tend to be closer to the actual environment of Scandinavia. I don't think I know many that would say that Thor is bigger in Norway than in Sweden, and Odin is bigger in Sweden. I mean, I think it's very difficult because you do have some areas in Sweden that were definitely you had names of, but you have the same in Norway. So it's very difficult to know because we have so limited data about it. We have such a limited. Unfortunately, it would be great to know more about it, but we don't. Like, the one thing that we can say is that some of these gods, for example, Odin to a degree, were more connected to certain social classes. That there were people from different from more. Odin was more the god of the aristocracy, and you could see some shifts in power when Odin became a major god in Scandinavia compared to before sort of the migration period when the Germanic tribes went down to Rome. But it's very difficult. It's a very difficult. Today, I don't see any big difference among modern heathens. I mean, I think that they are like Scandinavian heathens tend to be. I think many of them do choose a specific god as their main god that they worship, but most you don't see any distinction between the different regions of the world. At least I haven't seen anything. Again, Thor was probably both historically and perhaps even today the most popular god.
And we can say that how much the Germanics impact in some point the traditions of Norse religion. We can say that are some things that are very close, have some change. How do you see the perspective of these two different times in history.
Oh, you made the difference between the continental Germanic people and the Scandinavian?
No, in the past of the Germanics influence into the Viking Age religions, how much we can see this influence by the Germanics to the transition to Viking Age.
Well, I mean, the Germanic, I mean, the Scandinavia, like Swedish, Norwegian, Danish are all Germanic languages. So they are, so I mean, today we wouldn't understand each other at all. I mean, unless we knew, I mean, but historically, the Viking Age religion, as much we can of course argue, is that they are definitely Germanic-based religion. I mean, you have in that Germanic people among the continental Germanics, you have Wotan and then become Odin in Scandinavia, and you have a lot of those. There is, of course, major differences in the religions. For example, the Germanic areas or become Christians far earlier than Scandinavia. I mean, Scandinavia is one of the last regions in Europe, apart from Lithuania, that become Christian. There is an ongoing discussion on Scandinavian pagan religions, how to view them. Are they a part of? I mean, everyone agrees that they are, like, Scandinavian languages are a Germanic language that is in itself also, like, of course, an Indo-European language. Scandinavian religion during the Viking Age was, of course, based on similar ideas that you find in Germany or Germanic areas. But there is, of course, several hundreds of years where you have a separation when Germanic, like the continental Germanics, becomes Christian to a large degree. Not all of them, but most of them become Christian, and then you have like a big separation. Also, going to Scandinavia was not always that easy. It was like a quite isolated area. So those regions of Scandinavia will, of course, develop differently, and you see it linguistically, you see it also archaeologically. But of course, there are close connections. They did travel down to there. Scandinavian tribes are part of the migration period and all the. So there is like two major discussions there. One that wants to place the Vikings very closely into the Germanic field, that they are part of a continent. Like the difference between continental Germanic people and the Scandinavians are not that big. That they similar religion, similar. With, of course, the twists and differences you can find. The other is more to view Scandinavian religion as much more mixed, not only with the Germanic, but also with the Sami and those kind of indigenous people that lived up north that were more nomadic. And there is, again, very big debate about this. I'm not an expert on this area, so I'm not going to say what I personally believe, but of course, the Sami did influence the Viking, and vice versa. Of course, the Vikings did influence the Sami people. They had a very different relationship, as far as we know, between like today the Scandinavian, like the Viking, the pre-Christians had a very different relationship to each other, both like Scandinavian Vikings and Sami people, on a much more probably equal footing than later when Scandinavia became Christian and you had a more colonial mindset against the northern, like the Sami people. But so and I think that the truth is probably, the Scandinavians definitely were influenced by the Germanics because they were part of the same kind of cultural framework. But I think that there was also so significant differences due to time, due to ecological reasons, due to different historical and cultural developments that you didn't find in continental Germany. But you do find similar gods, like Thor, Odin, are also part, of course, of what we know about continental Germanic religion, which is way less than we know about Scandinavia.
Oh, so we saw the perspective that one are very connected to each other, and we saw that these connections are related to some traditions, some what can I say, some many specific things that were I think one originated each other. Example, the Germanic past influenced the many aspects of the Viking Age, but we know that many persons that are considered of these groups of Germanic are Scandinavians too, and that's interesting thing to see that. And for some perspectives that we saw in the neo-paganism, that say the modern paganism, is that we saw many aspects related to, how can I say, combine some things that are from some perspectives of literature, like the Eddas, like the sagas. And how did you see some these aspects represented in some, how can I say, some aspects that you saw that are using some perspectives that are connected to these rituals? We can say that some part of these rituals are very close to the literary things and some poetic things. How did we can describe some aspects of that?
You mean how, in what way they use the other in rituals?
Yes.
It's actually an American scholar living in Norway right now writing about that. There is an interesting. I would say that again, you can have a very different. It can differ very much because sometimes you find groups that will use the Eddic poems, particularly some of the passages that are almost like a liturgical text. They will read from them in the ritual. They will use the kind of prayers that can be found there. Others, like the big blutes in Uppsala, will most of the time use more, how to say it, the stories. They don't necessarily read much from the Eddic poems. They use the stories that they find both in the poetic and the prosaic Edda, but they're more sort of relaxed and more using innovation more. I think like the Eddic poems are interesting because like they are the primary source we have. They are the primary source we have for any type of understanding of an Old Norse worldview or Old Nordic worldview. And it is complicated because they were written centuries after Christianity had become the dominant religion in these areas. They most likely represent a very minor sort of corner of the worldview of the pre-Christians who live in Scandinavians. But they are what we have. They are sort of they are still the primary. Like most, there is again in academia, of course, a big debate on to what degree are the Eddic poems representing a pagan view or a Christian view. I mean, I would side more with the idea that they do represent a type of pagan worldview because the reasons why they were written was to make sure that people could understand poetry like Icelandic poetry, but still, regardless of that, there are of course very limited view of the worldview that existed, and but they are what they have, and I think that there is a sense, like I think many modern pagans, like Nordic modern pagans, will all have a relationship to the Eddic poems. They will all have kind of some type of, and I think that like you have two contradictory elements of it. One way that it's very common that they will make some references, they will make some poems, they will make some use of it. At the same time, there is also, of course, a very strong sense that this is not a holy text. Like paganism is not worshipping a book, like, or hedonism is not a book-based religion. It's something that's based on like direct experiences and nature, and there is no holy books and things like that. Still, you will always have to relate to it because that's where a lot of the sources are. But my feeling is that people they differ a lot to what degree they will sort of use them, and I think that is also, for example, more I would guess like most, for example, Swedish heathens or Swedish pagan will use the rituals will be in Swedish. They won't be in Icelandic or Old Norse. They will use mainly like Swedish, or in Norway you would find the same, of course, but in Norwegian. And that's also kind of a change that you go from, and it's also kind of an interesting difference between how you experience a ritual, comparing it to if you were from a non-Scandinavian country and became interested in Viking Age religion. It would sound more ceremonial or ritualistic than it would be for a person in Scandinavia, because it's just the language. So it's an interesting aspect of the way the Eddic poetry is used. I mean, that's not there is going to be an article published by my PhD student about that, which is very interesting. And he, but it's something I think more reconstructionist groups that are more conservative, they would probably use the Eddic poems more, which is quite obvious.
Oh, you say a very, very interesting thing, because it's a very problematic that sometimes persons say that have a holy book for the Old Norse religion and doesn't have, and this is very, very a good point that to say. And we saw that in some point we can say that the neo-paganism or the modern paganism that you was saying, that use some perspectives, saying that's not directly but indirectly, perspectives, Christians' perspectives from the Scandinavian. Example, we saw that the Eddas and sagas are scripted by Christians' visions, and the neo-paganism use sometimes these visions that are constructed. We can say that in some point we are using this form of Christianism to doing this modern paganism.
Yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, that is of course. I mean, like Nordic religion, like pre-Christian. I mean, many of the pre-Christian traditions in Europe and in other parts didn't write down much of the stuff. You had to rely on the later. It's the same with pre-Christian Sami religion. You had to rely on later Christian writings, and they can of course be more or less reliable. They can be, of course, more or less judgmental. I mean, the situation with the Viking Age is of course quite problematic in that sense, because there are, and there's still a very large ongoing debate among scholars to what degree we can trust the sources. How do they represent, the actual world? Like, did people believe like this? Or were they just an elite view? Was it a poetic view even among the pre-Christian pagans? So there is a lot of but you can't avoid, if you were into Greek or Roman paganism, you could quite easily find a lot of sources that were, even though there is a lot of sources are lost there as well. But then you have writings from you have Homer, you have people who were actually practicing these religions, that wrote a lot of stuff themselves, because they were a much more literary culture or cultures. Like the Nordic, Germanic, Celtic, and all of that don't have that. They were all, there were traces. Of course, in Scandinavia, you had runic writings, but they didn't write it on paper or in books that could have survived. They wrote it as a way of messaging. You have rune stones and things like that. And they give very, very limited information about the religious worldview. You have maybe a name of a god even among those rune stones that are written during a pre-Christian era. But you can't really create the whole religious view or understanding of the world based on that. So it's a very that is something that is, of course, also open to a lot of discussions, both among scholars but also in the heathen and pagan communities. How do we relate to the fact that most of these sources are Christian? They are not written by pagans. They're not written by heathens. Some would argue that Snorri Sturluson, actually was a secret pagan. There is no indication of that. I mean, everything in his writings very clearly indicate that he's quite, well-learned Christian. That he came from a Christian background. And that is always a big problem in how you relate to this kind of the problem of the sources not being written by the people who are practicing these religions. But as modern day pagans, they have to rely on this, because just as scholars have to rely on it, because there's very little else to go on.
That's interesting. And how we can say closely that the archaeological finds can tell us that this ritual was probably real, or some we can saw that are pictures that show an species like some type of ritual. We say that an example we have nowadays the Northman movie, and in something we saw the Ulfhednars and Berserks scene that are ritual, and we have this plate of helmets like the Torslunda helmet that are very coincident with the figure, and that was represent. And what we can say that in some points that this imaginary and in this image we can represent the real thing. In what the point that you come, or it's difficult to say no, it's probably we don't have how to say that this is a ritual, or this is some just like some clothes that they are using. What the limits for say about that?
Well, I mean, there are quite strong limits, of course, what you academically can say about something. But I mean, academia is not neutral either. I mean, that's also something to remember. And you make, of course, decisions on how far you want to go in interpretations. Like archaeology has, again, I'm not an archaeologist, but archaeology has confirmed some of the rituals that has been described, or in some of the, like, for example, like old Uppsala. Of course, we can't say, there is no indication that it looked like Adam of Bremen wrote or anything like that. But archaeology do confirm that there was some type of definitely, it was a populated area. There definitely were clear signs of ritual activities there. We can't say, anything. Like archaeologists cannot give us script on how people, what they said and anything like that. But archaeologists can confirm or deny some aspect of it, of course. But I think and I think what happened in Uppsala is a good example of also how ideology can shape our view of the past in many different ways. Because for a long time, particularly after World War II, and later in the 1960s, when there was a much stronger type of Marxist understanding in archaeology, there was definitely this very major trend that old Uppsala, was not like the references to a temple or a sacred place in Uppsala was, of course, not true. They really wanted to push the idea that old Uppsala was a completely useless place, and there was like nothing of importance there. That was not based on archaeology. That was based on science or academic research. That was based on a more ideological idea, because of a rejection of the use of Uppsala by more nationalistic oriented groups. So that's also something to remember, that not every time someone says that they don't have, so it goes both ways. I mean, we can't, there's a lot of stuff we can't say didn't happen. There is also a lot of stuff that we can't say did happen. So it's like two sides of it. But I think an important part is that people can make more or less sensible arguments for certain ritual activities or some practices, but there will always be a theoretical understanding. You will use a kind of theoretical framework to understand this, and they are, of course, driven by ideology from both sides. Again, I'm not a relativist here. I'm saying there are, but if you find something archaeologically they seem to confirm one position. There is of course a very strong argument that position is the one that are correct.
Well, that's a very interesting thing, because we can say that some of these symbolic things that we saw in archaeology, like the Thor hammers or some symbols, have some how much influence it have in these traditions for the neo-paganism and nowadays, and how symbols that were we can say that they are most used to represent these old traditions in from the north, because we saw that some symbols not are used in that period but become popular from these groups.
So there's a lot of the symbols. Different groups can more or less like different modern pagan groups can be more or less aware or interested in the past. So I think that you see different use of symbols that are like, for example, if you use the hammer of Thor, the Thor's hammer, that is of course one of the most common finds you have from the Viking Age. I mean, that's very, very common to find Thor's hammers in burials and things like. Most of those that have used it seems to have been women. Like I think the more women's graves that have like Thor's hammers, but it seems to be used by both men and women. I mean, there's like doesn't seem to be a difference, and it's also quite. I mean, in many ways, it's not a particularly surprising find, because I mean, Mjolnir is a protective symbol, which I mean, it's quite good to wear. If you sort of, it's quite good to have a protective symbol on you. That's definitely a symbol that goes back to the Viking Age. I mean, that's definitely a symbol that, you know, you have a lot of archaeological find. You know that people they were popular. People sold them. You also know that you have people who trade in these kind of symbols. They would quite happily be making both the hammer of Thor, and then they would make a Christian cross. You know, they didn't have the problem with they didn't care what religion you belonged to, as long as you bought their stuff, I guess. But that is, of course, the hammer of Thor is still one of the most popular symbols for heathenism, like Nordic paganism. I think that's by far the most popular one. People are still using it today. I mean, it's again that there is definitely a sense of it's not a bad symbol in that. I mean, there are some historical precedents to it, even though people in the Viking Age would probably have different views of it. Other symbols that you find in modern pagan groups are usually a little bit more, might be a bit more complicated. For example, there is a, I think one of the most famous is that, you know, is quite popular among tattoos is as I think it's Aegis Hjelm, which is like 8 with different, and that is a quite popular symbol. I would say particularly outside of Scandinavia, but that is of course an Icelandic symbol from a magical book in the I guess in the late Middle Ages, or even later than that. But it's not a symbol from the Viking Age. It's a way later symbol, and sometimes. There are different approaches among pagans to this kind of symbols. I mean, some would basically say, you know, wear whatever you want. If it's meaningful to you, then it's meaningful to you. You know, we don't know. Others would be more like, well, that's not a pagan symbol. On the other hand, which I mean, that's just different groups' behaviors. But I think that I would say that there you can find like these 3 triangles that are connected to Odin that some people would use. You know, you do find a lot of, but I think by far the hammer of Thor is still like the most common symbol that people would use, and probably the one that has the strongest historical pedigree, to say that. You find them everywhere in Sweden, for example. They sell them everywhere. Tourist shops and everything. I mean, Sweden is quite happy to make money of the Viking heritage. So, but I think that symbolic use can differ. But I think most heathens are well aware that everything that they do is modern. So there's no problem finding out new symbols. For example, one good example of a very modern way of using symbols would be the use of runes as something representing a complete sort of cosmology or complete. That is, of course, something very new also. But you also find a lot that people will have like images of runes or like as jewelry or tattoos, which is a very sort of modern understanding of the runes as being more as a sign of divination or something sacred than the language or this alphabet from the Viking Age.
It's a thing that we can say in some aspects that we have not only the image of symbols, but we saw that some figures are represented nowadays. We saw that we have how can I say wolfas that are represented nowadays. We have figures like the not like a specimen of us sacerdote or sorcerers nowadays with some that these figures are representing in this neo-paganism and nowadays. How we can say that these figures are using in these forms of actual traditions for the neo-paganism? They are a form to represent, to say we are connected to a past that we don't know, but we can represent in some point to.
Yes, I mean, you have, but I think the first one is like the magicians Seid Kuna, or like a Seid practicer, which is like a kind of, which is, I mean, people practice that still. I mean, that is an interest. I mean, not still, but people are today reconstructing an idea about what Seid would be. And it's very much close to modern ideas about shamanism. Again, what people who practice Seid historically believed and what they did, again, is very vague, and there's been different interpretations about it. Some have claimed it was a type of shamanism, or what's generally considered to be that, and some have argued that it wasn't. It was much more type of war magic that were not meaning a specific type of magic, but more something that referred to a group of people who practice on some, often women. It was very clearly connected to women. There are also, so today you have people who are using those sources as a kind of inspiration. They you definitely go to a New Age or pagan fair here, you will find people who claim to be a vulva, from the seer in the Poetic Edda. And so I think that it's more common that people will embrace the kind of religious practices, like the religious officers or magical officers that you find. You find people who will, of course, use the references to the berserkers or like, but it's not that easy to to sort of walk around being sort of angry and sort of be in a fit of rage. I mean, I don't think that would work in this very urban culture modern Sweden is. But you do find people using that as a source of inspiration for like particularly at more like Viking fairs and things like that, and sort of and people do. So I think that there are differences to what way people are, how serious it is, and how much they use it as something that's more playful, or but there's definitely these kind of images and cultural descriptions are, of course, a very, very important source to people's practices. even though it's through a very modern lens of modern ideas, modern paganism, modern like new age and things like that. So you definitely find, I think, particularly, I would say like Sade is probably like the biggest thing you can find that people are trying to recreate, although they don't have perhaps the war aspect of it that was probably quite common in the Viking Age.
Oh, it's interesting because we saw this with the figures like the priests in some of these rituals. They incorporated some aspects of of based in some points of the archaeological things or some literary things to create this personality. And this is interesting to see that because we saw that have a big movement and they are growing up many more this neo-paganism nowadays than specifically the Nordic with some, how can I say, the Viking mania is have growing up many more, and this is creating more persons interesting in doing part of these groups, and this is interesting to solve. And Professor, for our last question, I would like to know how we can say that the use of runes and use of some elements from the real Viking Age have some aspects that are using to describe these traditions nowadays. We can saw that the runes are still using for the magic beliefs from the, and how we can say that these aspects are have some connections with these traditions from past and to traditions from nowadays.
So the runes, that is a very contested topic, of course. Most of what we know about the runes, I mean, first of all, were the runes seen as magical in themselves? I mean, I think that's something that is a big difference between pre-Christian, or what we know perhaps about pre-Christian magic in Scandinavia, and later ideas about rune magic. It seems to be that the runes, carving runes that you find references to, seems to be more like spell casting, that people, you had a specific word that was spelled out, and perhaps it was that word that was the magical aspect of it, not the individual rune itself, because considering that the Vikings, or like people in Scandinavia, used runes to write the most ridiculous stuff. They would just use them to insult each other, or write, "This is a bridge, I own it." So clearly the runes were not something that was seen as being extremely sacred or mystical, but of course it did have a magical function, in the sense that words had a magical function. But modern day rune magic is based more on a similar idea that you find with the tarot, the idea that and the idea that every rune has a specific meaning that goes deeper than just the actual symbol. So and that is something that this starts to develop. You find traces of those ideas in 16th century Scandinavia, particularly in Sweden. You do find some ideas about that the runes are magical and they have a mystical power in themselves. I would say that modern day rune magic, are they primarily using, or are descendants of, the kind of late 19th century rune mysticism that developed in Germany and Austria, that for particular writers like Guido List, and but you have he is one of the first that actually identifies, of course, or argues as like different runes have a very different specific meaning. You do find traces of that in but not in a magical sense perhaps, but in some like farmers' almanacs in Scandinavia, and you have like rune years and things like that, where people do use. Now we're talking about the Christian period of time, where people do use runes as to identify different parts of the year. And you have rune poems where every rune is related to. I would say that today a lot of the modern practice of runes are, of course, related to using a mixture of Guido List and the rune poems and like the runic alphabet. But it's a mixture of sources that are used to create what is today like rune magic, or it is an interesting topic. I think it's a very interesting subject. I haven't seen any real. I mean, there are some scholars who would argue that like modern day rune magic do have a very like runes in the Viking Age actually were more magical, that they actually were used for magic. Like individual runes had a magical power. I mean, I'm not the one to say about most of the stuff I read would sort of perhaps not agree with that, but it is an open academic question. That's something one should remember. It's not set in stone. It's an ongoing debate about. But today, of course, we do see people using runes in very many different ways, from divination to art to religious ceremonies. So today, they are definitely become a very like powerful magical tool for the individual practitioner, at least.
Oh, it's we saw that we can say that these have some type of connection that we say because we use in some points that the Scandinavian folklore example, and the figures of Scandinavian folklore have the same purpose that of using the gods or the presence in these modern traditions of interpretations of Old Norse. Can say that they use a combine of the Norse mythology and this is Scandinavian folklore in these aspects.
You mean the modern view of Thor, or
the modern view of the how can I say the neo-paganism,
I'm just so I understand. You mean sorry, so I'm not misunderstanding. You mean the modern view of the Futhark, or the runic? Sorry, it was a word I misunderstood.
Yeah, sorry. Let me explain again. We saw that many moonstones have descriptions sometimes with aspects of figures of Scandinavian folklore. And this sometimes is as related to our traditions of runes traditions. So we can say that in the neo-paganism are using the Scandinavian folklore elements to complement the Old Norse traditions, like in some aspects, we can say that figures of these Scandinavian folklores are using nowadays for these actual traditions.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would like that. This might be like Scandinavian folklore is extremely interesting. I would argue that that's one of the most interesting sources you could have. I would say I feel that modern pagans use folklore too little. I would hope that they would use it more, because you do have like Thor and Odin and Freyr and all of those gods appearing, but they do appear in a very different setting. They do appear quite differently. Particularly Odin becomes very interesting in Scandinavian folklore, and particularly Swedish folklore, where he becomes a much darker, almost like a demonic figure. Like folklore is an interesting, like folklore is one of the areas where you could sort of argue that you do see pagan survivals in a way. I mean, the gods have become very different. They are no longer, they have to interact with the new surface, like the new Christianity that comes into play. And I think that modern pagans, particularly in Sweden and Scandinavia generally, of course, but I'm talking about like since I'm Swedish myself, I'm much more aware of Sweden. There are definitely some books on folklore that have always been very important and very popular in modern heathen communities. And I think sometimes that sometimes is one of the major differences between you find in Scandinavian heathenism and heathenism outside of Scandinavia, like in the United States or in England, is sometimes kind of the lack of the, like in Anglophone countries and people who don't like speak Swedish or Norwegian or Danish or Icelandic, they do tend to focus a lot on the published material, like the Eddic poems, like scholarly work. While of course the Scandinavian pagans can, or Scandinavian heathens, they can also relate a lot to studies on folklore and folk memories and references that, you know, makes it much closer. It makes it more alive in one way, because like particularly if you were raised in a Swedish countryside, you would have heard about Thor when you were little, not Thor from the Eddic poem, not the Thor, you know, but Thor from folklore. Thor that were sort of chasing trolls. That was something. When there was thunder, there was Thor that chasing trolls. That was something that even I mean, I heard it when I was little. It was not that my parents took it seriously, but it was a story that had been told to them, which is again something that is in a way more and more disappearing. So folklore is a very interesting area in itself, and I mean, as an outsider, sort of looking into this, but as a Scandinavian outsider, I always feel that folklore has so much more to offer to actually than maybe. I mean, the Icelandic sagas are interesting, but folklore is really one area where you can find a lot of very, very interesting things. It also shows how a new culture, in that sense, Christianity, relates to and how it sort of both integrates and demonizes things from a pre-Christian past. Again, folklore in Scandinavia is of course Christian. We're talking about people are Christians, but there is a lot of interesting things in them. And there is, of course, modern day pagans will of course use that as a source as well, sometimes to broaden out their view of what the gods were or things like that.
Oh, okay, it's amazing. Know all these things about this topics related to the Old Norse and the Neo-paganism. Professor, I would like to thank you for doing the interview here in the channel. It was a big pleasure receiving you here. You told us many things very interesting about the actual traditions to the past traditions, and this is very important, I think, subject here in the channel, because many persons know about how traditions and modern traditions are talking with the old traditions too, and this is very interesting to talking to you about that. Thank you so much for
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just stop the recording here.